Hello, Year 4. So I wonder whether this really will be the last time Pip sees his father. Let's hope he turns up at the Globe Theatre the following day. Chapter 50. Pip sat on the edge of the stage and looked out at the empty theatre. Overhead, the sun had set and the last tinges of pink were fading from the sky. Everyone had gone home. Pip and Miranda had the whole place to themselves. They could work all night. By the time Cuthbert Burbage arrived in the morning, Miranda's performance would be perfect, but neither of them felt much like working. In the corner of the pit, Miranda was sprawled on a patch of mud, dozing. Pip was sitting on the edge of the stage, swinging his legs in the air and staring into space, trying to reach a decision. He didn't know what to do. He felt as if he was standing at a crossroads, given the choice between two paths, and he had no idea which to take. Should he follow his father's advice and forget the weasel? Or should he follow his own instincts, which were telling him to jump off the stage right now, hurry to the weasel's house, draw his knife from his scabbard and take his revenge? If he was sensible, he'd rehearse with Miranda until the theatre grew dark, then climb the stairs to the top gallery, tie her rope to his ankle, pull the blanket over his body and fall asleep. And yet, if he spent his life being sensible, he'd never have left home in the first place, come to London, met his father, or acquired Miranda. If he'd been sensible, he'd still be lying in the storeroom at home, listening to the regular rasp of his stepfather's snores. And yet, that didn't mean he should throw himself into danger at every opportunity. Tomorrow afternoon, Pip should be taking his sternest test, showing whether he had the guts and skill to become a full-time member of the company. Rather than worrying about the weasel, he should be rehearsing Miranda for her performance. And yet, he didn't want to stay here, learning the cues for Much Ado About Nothing, while, less than a mile away, a man was plotting his father's death, a man who Pip had already sworn to kill. And yet his father was right. Fighting the weasel would be madness. He'd never even killed a man, while the weasel had murdered maybe 50. And yet he trusted his own skill with a knife. He was young and fit, and he knew what he was doing. In a fair fight, wouldn't he have a good chance, even against an experienced killer like the weasel? And yet, he'd made a solemn promise to his father. "Keep out of my business," George had said, "and I'll keep out of yours. Will you promise me you'll do that?" "I promise," Pip had said. And yet he remembered how George had treated his mother and him. Marriage was a promise, not just any old promise. Marriage was a solemn vow made in church before God. George had broken that, so he obviously didn't take promises very seriously. And yet, Pip didn't know what to do. As soon as he believed he'd made a decision, he saw why it was wrong. Thoughts flooded his mind, tugging him in different directions, persuading him of the perfect sense of each possible action, urging him to be brave, to be sensible, to be cunning, to be calm, to be a good boy, to be a good son, to be a man. He glanced at Miranda, but she was no help, just snoozing in a heap, oblivious to his worries. If he was going to make this decision, he'd have to do it himself, without any assistance from anyone. He stood up. Indecision was driving him crazy. He was being pulled one way, then another. His mind felt as if it were going to break into pieces, torn apart by conflicting thoughts. He took a few paces backwards and stood in the middle of the stage. If he were an actor, this is where he'd stand when he was talking to the audience. This is where Richard Burbage always stood, for instance, when he was acting Hamlet and discussing his dilemmas with the audience, allowing them a glimpse of his innermost thoughts. "That's it," thought Pip. Hamlet dithered and dallied, he thought, just like me, unable to decide what to do, paralysed by all the possibilities, but he finally made up his mind and did the right thing. He drew his sword and took his revenge, driving the blade through his uncle's guts. Pip could almost feel the presence of Hamlet here on the stage, standing beside him, whispering what he'd learnt. "Do what you think is right. Be brave, even if it kills you." "I will," thought Pip. "I'll unsheathe my father's dagger and take revenge on the weasel for the wrongs he has done me and my family, even if it kills me." Nothing felt better than making a decision. All the panic, all the thoughts that had been competing for his attention flowed out of his brain and body, leaving him cool and calm and completely confident. He knew what he was doing and why. He knew where he was going, Everything made sense. He jumped off the stage, ran across the pit to Miranda, picked up her rope and gave it a swift tug. "Come on," he said. "Let's go." Miranda lifted her head and looked at him. "Go?" her expression seemed to be saying. "Go? Now? Don't you realise what time it is?" But when Pip tugged the rope again, she struggled to her feet without any protest and followed him out of the theatre. Pip found the house without taking a single wrong turning. He felt proud of himself, a proper Londoner, finding his own way through the streets of Suffolk, even in the middle of the night. He and Miranda stood in the shelter of the darkest shadows and stared down the cramped street at the Weasel's home. Through the shutters of a first-floor window he could see the flicker of a candle and the movement of shadows cast onto a wall. Someone was still awake. The moon hadn't yet risen, but it would be full tonight, just what he needed. The two of them retreated to a dark doorway from where they could see the just half-shuttered window with its flickering shadows. Pip sat cross-legged. Miranda stretched full length on the ground and fell asleep immediately. Pip didn't even feel dozy. He kept his eyes fixed on the house. He was ready. This was the reason he'd come to London. This was the test that he'd set himself. Tonight he would finally have the chance to take his revenge.